The evening settled slow over Bramble Creek, like a heavy blanket laid across the land. Dust hung in the air, turning the fading sunlight into a soft, amber haze. Clara stood at the edge of her porch, the boards creaking under her bare feet, and stared out toward the ridge where the horizon broke against the sky. She had worked herself to the bone that day, kneading dough with trembling hands, patching the hole in her boyish shoes, sweeping the same porch that would never truly come clean. But no matter how much she did, the ache inside her stayed the same. She pulled the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little against the creeping chill. The prairie wind carried the smell of rain and something else, a faint metallic tang that told her trouble wasn't far behind. She had known it would come. She had read it in the man's letters, in the threats that came scrawled in drunken handwriting. "I'll be back for what's mine." He always said it like she was a thing he'd misplaced, not a woman who'd fled to keep her child safe. Her little boy, Samuel, slept inside, curled beneath a quilt too small for him now. He was 6, all bones and big eyes, dreaming soft and innocent dreams. He didn't know that the man who had hurt his mother was riding closer each day. She'd kept that truth from him the way she kept the wind from blowing through the cracks in the wall, doing her best, knowing it would never be enough. Then she saw him, a dark figure on horseback, cresting the ridge. The horse was chestnut brown, its mane glinting like copper in the sun's dying light. The man rode steady, not like the others who came through town chasing drink or trouble. There was purpose in the way he held himself, quiet, worn, and certain. Clara's heart caught against her ribs. It wasn't the man from her past, she could tell by the horse, by the calm in his posture. Still, she almost stepped back into the safety of her home. Almost. But then she thought of Samuel, of how he'd asked that morning, "Mama, when will Daddy come home?" And how she couldn't bring herself to tell him that some fathers never should. The rider slowed as he reached her gate, dust swirling around his boots. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who looked like he belonged to the land. His coat was worn at the seams, his gloves cracked, and yet he carried himself with a quiet kind of dignity that no poverty could wash away. His face was half hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, but his eyes, when they lifted to hers, were the color of river stone, gray, steady, patient. "You all right, ma'am?" he called out, voice low, even, careful not to startle her. Clara hesitated, clutching her shawl. "No," she said finally, her voice breaking on the single word. "Not tonight, I'm not." He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud. "What's happened?" She looked away, to the horizon, where the light had gone from gold to gray. "There's a man coming for me. A man I used to know. He thinks I owe him something." Her breath caught, and she pressed her trembling hands together. "He was cruel, sir. And if he finds me," she couldn't finish. Her throat felt like it was closing. The rancher's expression didn't change, but something in his stance softened. "You want me to stay?" She nodded once, then shook her head, unsure what she wanted anymore. "He won't believe you're a stranger. He'll come harder if he thinks I've taken in another man." "Then what is it you need?" he asked gently. Clara looked at the house, the single window glowing faintly, the cracked door, the life she'd built with scraps and prayer. She thought of Samuel sleeping inside, his small chest rising and falling, the way he whispered, "Mama," even in his dreams. And then the words fell from her lips before she had time to stop them. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling, "be my husband. Just for tonight." The silence that followed stretched long and thin, like the pause before a storm breaks. The man didn't move, didn't speak. She could hear her own heartbeat hammering in her ears. For a moment she thought he'd laugh, or turn his horse around and ride off into the dusk. But he didn't. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way no man had in years. He saw the fear under her composure, the strength beneath her frailty. Then he took off his hat, holding it to his chest, and said quietly, "All right." Her breath shuddered out. She hadn't realized she'd been holding it. "You'll do it." "I'll do it," he said simply. He stepped closer, and for the first time she saw the faint scar running along his jaw, the lines that carved into his face like a map of loss. There was no pity in his eyes, only understanding. She led him to the porch, her fingers brushing the chipped railing. "My name's Clara," she said softly. "Eli," he replied. Inside, the house smelled faintly of bread gone stale and firewood. The floor creaked under his weight as he followed her in. She moved carefully, as if afraid to disturb the quiet, and he noticed the tiny handprints on the table, the small wooden horse carved from pine sitting by the window. In the corner, a little boy stirred. Samuel blinked sleepily, rubbing his eyes. "Mama." Clara turned, forcing a smile. "It's all right, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." But Samuel's gaze had already found Eli. He sat up, his hair mussed from dreams. "Is that him?" he asked, voice full of innocent hope. "Is that Daddy?" Clara froze. The air in the room felt fragile enough to shatter. Eli knelt beside the boy's bed, his weathered hands gentle. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's me." Samuel smiled, the kind of smile that could melt any man's heart, and his small hand reached out. Eli took it, just for a moment. The boy's grip was warm, trusting. Then he drifted back to sleep, still smiling. Clara turned away, her eyes wet. "You didn't have to say that," she murmured. Eli stood, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said quietly. "But it seemed right." For a long while, they said nothing. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The candle flickered, throwing soft light over the room. Clara sat by the fire, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, revealing the thin fabric of her dress and the faint bruises that never quite faded. Eli saw them but didn't speak of them. He only took a seat near the door, his posture calm but ready, as if he'd made up his mind that no harm would touch this house while he was inside it. When the clock struck 9, the last bit of daylight gone, Clara whispered, "Thank you." He looked at her, eyes steady. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Night's just getting started." She wanted to ask him what kind of man says yes to a stranger's plea, what kind of heart answers fear with silence and presence instead of questions. But she didn't. Some things didn't need explaining. Outside, the horizon darkened completely. The storm that had been threatening all day gathered strength somewhere in the distance. Thunder rolled softly, a warning. Inside that small, broken house, two souls who had nothing left but their pain sat in the flicker of candlelight, pretending, for one night, that kindness could be enough to hold back the dark. The night had deepened into something almost tangible, heavy with rain and wind that shook the little cabin in Bramble Creek. The storm had arrived without warning, as if the skies themselves had decided to mirror the tension within the small home. Rain pelted the tin roof in sharp, rhythmic bursts, rattling against the wooden beams and making the oil lamp flicker and sway. Clara held her son close, his small arms clinging to her neck as if he knew, somewhere deep inside, that the danger she feared was not entirely gone. Eli sat near the door, the shotgun resting across his knees, his hands firm and steady. He was soaked through, his coat darkened by the downpour, yet his posture was calm, unyielding, as if the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had always raged inside him. His eyes were fixed on the front window, watching the shadows the wind cast, listening for every sound that might signal trouble. Clara whispered into Samuel's hair, trying to soothe him, her voice barely audible over the storm. "It's all right, sweet boy. Nothing's going to hurt us. I promise." Her words felt fragile even to her own ears, but she clung to them as if repetition could make them true. She could feel Eli's presence behind her, like a solid wall of reassurance. Though they were strangers to each other, he had become a shield, a husband for the night, as she had begged him, yet more than that, a guardian who didn't flinch at her fear. She hesitated to speak, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. "Do you think he'll come?" she asked finally, voice trembling. Eli didn't turn to her immediately. His eyes scanned the horizon beyond the small window, the storm outside blurring the shapes of the world. "If he said he would, then yes," he said quietly. "Men like that always do." Clara's hands clenched the edges of her shawl. "You don't even know me," she whispered, a tinge of wonder in her voice, "and yet you stayed." Eli's lips curved in the faintest of smiles, but his expression remained calm. "You asked," he said simply. The wind rattled the walls, throwing the lamp's light into dancing shadows that stretched across the room. Clara looked at Eli, really looked at him for the first time in the pale glow. There were lines carved into his face, the faint scar along his jaw, the exhaustion in his eyes. Each mark spoke of loss and hard labor, yet his presence was steady, unshakable. She saw a man who had known grief and had survived it, a man whose strength was not loud or brash but quiet, enduring, like the mountains surrounding the town. Her gaze fell to the floor. "I know you've lost someone too," she murmured, hesitant, almost afraid of the answer. Eli's eyes softened, the faintest flicker of pain crossing his features. He nodded once. A wife, he said after a pause. And a little girl. Fever took them last winter. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and she pressed a hand to her chest. She hadn't expected him to answer so openly, hadn't expected the shared ache to make the room feel heavier yet somehow warmer. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling with empathy. He nodded, looking at the floor. "So am I." There was a long silence after that, broken only by the storm outside. The wind rattled the windows and the rain struck the roof with relentless energy. Then came a sharp, sudden noise, hooves pounding the wet ground outside. Clara froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Eli rose swiftly, alert, every muscle tensed. "Stay with your boy," he ordered gently, though there was no harshness in his tone, only authority. "Keep him safe." Clara clutched Samuel tighter, her face pale and drawn. She watched as Eli stepped toward the door, his coat slick with rain, his figure a defiant shadow against the lightning-lit night. The shadow outside paced the porch, a man whose drunken threats had haunted Clara's days for months. His voice carried across the storm, thick with malice. "Clara, you can't hide from me forever." Eli opened the door with deliberate slowness, the wind and rain lashing at him like a physical force, yet he stood firm, unmoved by the tempest. "She's not hiding," he called, his voice cutting through the storm. "She's with her husband." The man laughed, wet and wild-eyed, swaying slightly as he tried to keep balance against the wind. "Her husband's dead, stranger. You think putting on the part for one night makes it true?" Eli didn't flinch. He leveled the shotgun with steady hands, the cold metal firm against his palms. "If you take another step," he said, his voice low and unwavering, "I'll make sure it's true for you instead." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. The rain beat down harder, the wind shrieked, yet in that moment, everything centered on the man in the doorway and the figure on the porch. Something in Eli's tone, quiet, certain, and final, made the drunken man hesitate. He spat on the ground, cursed under his breath, and then, after a long pause, turned away, stumbling into the darkness, disappearing into the night. Eli remained where he was for a few moments longer, letting the sound of the man's retreat fade completely before he finally stepped back inside. His coat was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, but his movements were calm, deliberate. He closed the door behind him, the storm now a muffled roar rather than a threat pressing against the walls. Clara let out a shuddering breath, her son still curled in her arms. "You didn't have to," she began, but words failed her. "I know," Eli said softly, finally allowing himself to remove his wet gloves. He hung them carefully by the hearth, as if even the smallest acts of order mattered after the chaos of the storm. But it seemed right. For a long while, they sat in silence. The only sounds were the soft patter of rain against the windows, the occasional crackle from the dying fire, and Samuel's light, even breathing. Clara studied Eli quietly, seeing in him a man who had chosen to stay for someone else's sake, who had placed his own fears and grief aside to protect a stranger. Eventually, she reached out, brushing a damp lock of hair from his forehead. "Eli," she whispered, her voice tentative, almost shy. "I don't know how to thank you." He met her gaze, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A connection formed not from love, but from shared humanity, from the kind of understanding that comes only when two people face fear together and survive it. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just, live safe. For your boy." Clara's lips trembled, and she nodded, the warmth in her chest slowly easing the cold dread that had gripped her hours ago. "And if I asked again," she said, almost a whisper, "one day, not just for a night." Eli's eyes softened, a faint, rare smile touching his lips. "Then I reckon I'd still say yes," he murmured, his voice carrying a quiet promise that neither of them could fully understand yet, but both felt deeply. Outside, the storm began to lessen, the rain turning into a soft drizzle, the wind weakening to a sigh. The first hints of dawn brushed the horizon in soft pinks and purples, illuminating Bramble Creek in a light that felt fragile yet full of hope. Inside the little house, the fire burned low but steady, casting a golden glow over the two souls who had faced the night together. The world outside had not changed, the wind would return, the threats might come again, and the hardships of life in Bramble Creek would persist. But inside that small, battered cabin, there was safety, warmth, and the beginnings of trust. For one night, at least, they had created a sanctuary. Clara held her son close, feeling the weight of the night lift slightly. Eli remained near the door, a silent sentinel, but occasionally his gaze would meet hers, and in that moment, she saw not a stranger, not a man performing a role, but someone who had chosen to fight for her and her child. And for the first time in a long while, Clara allowed herself to hope. The storm had passed, but something stronger remained, the unspoken bond of protection, courage, and the quiet, fragile beginnings of love that could grow in the smallest, most unexpected places. And though they would not claim forever that night, it was enough. It was enough to heal, enough to promise, and enough to change the course of their lives, quietly, irrevocably, together.